I used to believe being ready for a baby meant having your life in order. A steady paycheck, a place to live, some kind of plan for tomorrow. What no one ever told me, at least not plainly, was that readiness has very little to do with any of that. Readiness is about honesty, and I wasn't being honest with myself. If you're listening to this and you've already raised children or you're watching your grandchildren grow now, you probably already know where the story's going. You might even be shaking your head a little, thinking, yeah, I remember that feeling. But back then, I thought I was different. I thought I was ready. I was wrong. The moment she told me she was pregnant didn't feel the way people describe it in movies. There was no music playing in the background, no tears of joy, no jumping up and down. There was just a pause. A long one. She stood there holding the test like it might change its mind if she stared at it hard enough. I remember trying to break the tension because that's what I always did when things got uncomfortable. I said something stupid. I said, well, I guess we know it works. She didn't laugh. That silence should have told me everything I needed to know. But at the time, I didn't know how to listen to silence. I only knew how to talk over it. I told her I was ready. I told my friends I was ready. I told myself I was ready. I said things like, people have been having babies forever, and we'll figure it out, and my personal favorite, God won't give you more than you can handle. That last one sounds good, it really does, but if you've lived long enough, you know something most people don't like to admit. Figuring it out is not the same thing as being ready. At that point in my life, I didn't want wisdom. I wanted confidence. Confidence feels better. It's lighter. It doesn't ask as many questions. And I had plenty of confidence, right up until responsibility started knocking. Pregnancy has a way of doing that. It doesn't rush you, but it doesn't wait either. Time just keeps moving forward. Weeks pass, doctor appointments come and go, conversations get more serious. And every day, the future steps a little closer. Here's something I want to ask you, and you don't have to answer it out loud. Have you ever agreed to something big, something life-changing, and only later realized you never stopped to ask yourself if you truly wanted it or if you just didn't want to disappoint anyone? That was me. I didn't want to look unsure. I didn't want to look weak, and I definitely didn't want to admit I was scared. Men from my generation didn't grow up doing that. We grew up handling things, or at least pretending we were. Pregnancy changed her in ways I didn't fully understand at first. Not physically, emotionally. She became quieter. Not distant, just thoughtful, more serious. She asked questions about the future, about money, about stability, about what kind of life we were building. I answered with jokes, with reassurance, with half attention. What I didn't do was lean in. And here's something I learned much later in life. Not leaning in is still a choice. Silence doesn't show up all at once. It sneaks in. It starts small. A conversation that ends early. A question that doesn't get asked. A feeling that never quite makes it out of your chest. Then one day, it's sitting between you on the couch, lying in bed with you at night, following you from room to room. I told myself it was normal. I blamed hormones, stress, life. I said everything except the truth. I was scared. You know how men say, I'm just tired? That's usually code for about 5 emotions we don't know how to name. I was exhausted, not from work, from pretending I had everything under control. I underestimated pregnancy. That was one of my biggest mistakes. I thought it was something happening to her, not something happening to us. Pregnancy doesn't just prepare a woman to become a mother, it puts a spotlight on a relationship. It shows you what's solid and what's been held together by routine and hope. And cracks don't always show right away. Sometimes they wait. When people hear the word betrayal, they usually think about cheating. that wasn't this. Not yet. This kind of betrayal was quieter. It was absence. It was being physically present but emotionally unavailable. It was choosing comfort over honesty, silence over courage. When someone is carrying your child, your silence speaks louder than anything you say. One night, she asked me a question that should have stopped me in my tracks. She said, "Do you even want this baby?" She didn't yell. She didn't accuse me of anything. She just asked. I laughed because that's what I did when I didn't know how to tell the truth. "Of course I do," I said. "Why would you even ask that?" She nodded, but her eyes told me she didn't believe me. Not completely. And if you've lived long enough, you know when someone stops arguing and starts nodding, something has already changed. Time started moving faster after that. Months passed, appointments stacked up, plans were made, and with every step forward, I realized I was still standing in the same place emotionally, telling myself I'd catch up later. Later never came. At a family gathering, someone asked me a simple question. "So, how does it feel knowing you're about to be a dad?" I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't have words, because the truth scared me. And she saw it. That was the moment I realized people can sense when your heart isn't where your words are. That night, after everyone left, she said something to me, just one sentence, that shifted everything. No anger, no drama, just clarity. And in that moment, whether I wanted to admit it or not, I knew I was about to find out how unready I really was. I just didn't know how far that truth was going to go or how much it was going to cost. She didn't raise her voice when she said it. That was the part that stuck with me. No shouting, no accusations, no tears. She just said, "I don't think you're really here anymore." At first, I wanted to argue, not because she was wrong, but because being confronted like that makes you feel exposed. And when people feel exposed, they either get honest or defensive. I chose defensive. I told her she was overthinking things. I told her I was stressed. I told her I was doing the best I could. And maybe I believed that. But what I didn't realize then was that doing your best doesn't always mean doing what's needed. She stopped pushing after that. That should have worried me. When someone stops pushing, it usually means they've started protecting themselves. The house got quieter. Not peaceful, just quiet. We still talked about practical things, appointments, groceries, bills, but the deeper conversations faded away. The kind that start with, "Can we talk?" and end with both people feeling seen. Those disappeared. I told myself this was just part of pregnancy. I told myself things would go back to normal after the baby came. That's another lie people tell themselves. Nothing goes back to normal after a baby. It only goes forward. One night, I came home later than usual. Not because I was cheating, not because I was doing anything wrong. I just didn't want to come home yet. That realization hit me harder than I expected. When your own home starts to feel like pressure instead of comfort, something is already broken. She was sitting on the couch when I walked in. The lights were low, the TV was on, but she wasn't watching it. She looked at me and said, "I had my appointment today." I froze. I should have known. I should have remembered, but I didn't. I asked how it went, trying to sound casual, like it hadn't slipped my mind completely. She told me the baby was healthy. Then she paused. That pause felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. She said, "I wish you had been there." I didn't know what to say. There was no excuse that didn't sound small in that moment. I apologized. I meant it. But apologies don't undo patterns. They don't erase absence. They don't rewind moments. Something shifted after that. Not dramatically, subtly. She stopped updating me on every little thing, stopped sharing every thought, stopped inviting me into moments I should have already been stepping into. I thought she was pulling away. What I didn't understand was that she was adjusting. People do that when they realize they're carrying more than they should alone. Here's something nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't always explode. Sometimes it erodes, little by little, until one day you realize the foundation isn't as solid as you thought. I underestimated her strength. I underestimated her awareness. I underestimated how much she was noticing while I was telling myself everything was fine. There was a night I tried to fix things. I told her I wanted to do better. I told her I was nervous. I told her I didn't know how to say everything I was feeling. She listened quietly. Then she asked me something I wasn't prepared for. She said, "Why didn't you tell me that before?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I didn't want to admit weakness, not to her, not to myself. Men my age were taught that fear is something you swallow, not something you share. But swallowing fear doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it come out sideways. She went to bed early that night. I stayed up, sitting in the dark, realizing that I had confused being present with being nearby. Those are not the same thing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and with every passing day, I felt this growing distance that I didn't know how to cross anymore. I started noticing small things. She stopped asking my opinion about names, stopped sharing her worries out loud, stopped looking to me for reassurance. And here's the part that still hurts to admit. A part of me felt relieved. Relieved that the pressure was off. Relieved that I didn't have to face my fear head on. That relief was the real betrayal. Because while I was avoiding discomfort, she was preparing for motherhood, alone. One evening, she told her mother was coming to stay for a while. She said it casually, like it wasn't a big deal, but it felt like one. Her mother had always been supportive, but this felt different. It felt permanent. I asked how long she was staying. She shrugged and said, "We'll see." That answer sat with me all night. I started realizing something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. She was building a safety net, and she wasn't sure I was part of it. That thought scared me more than the pregnancy ever had. I tried to step up after that. Went to appointments, asked questions, offered help, but something about it felt late, like showing up after the credits have already started rolling. She appreciated the effort, but appreciation isn't the same as trust. Trust is built when someone shows up before they're asked. One night, while we were lying in bed, she said something quietly, almost to herself. She said, "I didn't think I'd feel this alone while pregnant." That sentence cut deeper than any argument, because it wasn't angry. It was honest. And honesty hurts when you know you're the reason for it. I wanted to promise her things would change, but I had already made too many promises I hadn't kept. So I stayed quiet. And in that silence, something final began to form. I just didn't realize yet that she had already made a decision, one that was going to hit me later, much later, when I least expected it. By the time I realized something was truly wrong, it wasn't because of a fight. It was because of how calm everything had become. Not peaceful calm, organized calm. The kind of calm that comes when someone has stopped waiting for you to change. She moved differently, more deliberate, more independent. She didn't announce her plans anymore. She informed me of them. That difference matters more than people realize. I'm going to my sister's this weekend. My mom's coming with me to the appointment. I already handled it. Already handled it. At first, I told myself that was a good thing, that it meant she was strong, capable, on top of things, and she was. But what I didn't want to admit was this. She no longer expected me to handle things with her. That expectation had quietly expired. I underestimated how much damage had already been done. Men like me tend to think problems announce themselves loudly, with arguments, with threats, with ultimatums. But the most serious decisions are often made quietly, internally, while the other person is still telling himself, "We're fine." I remember one afternoon coming home and noticing that some of her things had been moved. Not packed, just reorganized. Her important papers were together. Medical documents, insurance information, a folder I hadn't seen before. I asked her about it. She said, "I'm just getting things in order." That sounded reasonable, responsible. I didn't hear the subtext. The subtext was this: I'm preparing in case I can't rely on you. I still thought I had time. That was my biggest mistake. I thought effort could be delayed, that I could show up later and it would count the same. Life doesn't work like that. Pregnancy doesn't work like that. Trust definitely doesn't work like that. There was a day I finally asked her what she was thinking, not accusingly, genuinely. I said, "You've been really quiet lately." She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then she said, "I've said everything I needed to say already." That sentence landed heavier than anything she could have yelled, because it told me something I wasn't ready to hear. She had already tried. I was just too busy being scared to notice. I started replaying moments in my head, appointments I missed, conversations I brushed off, times I chose comfort over presence. I told myself those were small things, but small things add up. They always do. One evening, I tried to joke like I used to, tried to bring back the version of us that felt lighter. She smiled politely, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's when it hit me. You can't joke your way back into trust. You can't charm your way out of emotional debt. Debt collects interest, and I was behind. I asked her if she was happy. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I don't have the energy to think about that right now." That answer scared me more than a simple no would have, because it meant survival had replaced connection. She was conserving herself. That's what people do when they stop believing support is coming. I still didn't think she would leave. I want to be honest about that. I truly believed that as long as I stayed physically present, everything would somehow hold together. That belief came from underestimating her strength, her clarity, her willingness to choose peace over familiarity. Men from my generation were taught that women endure, that they stay, that time fixes things. Those lessons were incomplete. One night, I overheard her on the phone. She was speaking softly, but I could hear enough. "I just need to make sure everything's set before the baby comes." Set. That word echoed in my head. She wasn't talking about cribs or diapers. She was talking about her life. I asked her who she was talking to. She said, "My cousin." I asked, "What about?" She said, "Just planning." Planning what? I didn't ask. And that's the truth that hurts the most. I didn't ask because a part of me didn't want to know the answer. Avoidance feels safer than clarity until clarity arrives anyway. The baby kicked one night while my hand was on her stomach. For a moment, everything felt real in a way it hadn't before. I smiled. I felt proud. I felt scared. I felt late. I told her, "I'm really going to be a dad." She nodded and said, "Yeah." Just, yeah. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't new to her anymore. She had already crossed that emotional bridge. I was just now stepping onto it. I thought I was catching up. I didn't realize she was already walking in a different direction. The shock didn't come all at once. It was building, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when I could no longer pretend everything was going to work itself out. And when that moment came, it came fast. The thing about late realizations is that they don't announce themselves as panic at first. They arrive as discomfort, a tightness in your chest you can't quite explain, a feeling that something important is happening without you, a sense that the ground underneath what you believed was solid isn't. I started noticing how often she was no longer around when I expected her to be. Not gone, just unavailable. Out with her sister, at her mother's place, running errands that somehow took most of the day. She didn't hide it. She didn't lie. That's what made it harder to accuse her of anything. She was living her life. I was the one who had stopped being central to it. One afternoon, I came home early and found her sitting at the table with papers spread out in front of her. Forms, notes, lists written in her handwriting. I asked what she was working on. She said, "Just getting things together." That phrase again. I stood there longer than necessary, hoping she'd say more. She didn't, so I tried something different. I asked, "Is there something you want to talk about?" She looked up at me, and for a moment I thought she might finally let everything spill out. Instead, she said, "I'm tired." And she was telling the truth, just not the whole one. There's a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. It comes from carrying too much alone. I started realizing that the baby wasn't the only thing she was preparing for. She was preparing for disappointment. That's a different kind of readiness. I tried harder after that, or at least I thought I did. I asked more questions, offered more help, said the right things at the right times. But something about it felt forced, like I was responding instead of leading, like I was showing up because I was afraid of losing her, not because I finally understood her. People can feel the difference. She appreciated the effort, but appreciation isn't the same as relief. Relief comes when you no longer feel alone, and she still did. There was a night when she asked me what kind of father I thought I'd be. It seemed like a simple question. I answered with something vague, something safe. "I'll do my best," I said. She nodded. Then she asked, "But what does that actually mean?" I didn't know. That silence stretched longer than I expected. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking for presence, clarity, commitment that didn't have to be pulled out of me. I underestimated how much she was watching my actions instead of listening to my words. I underestimated how much she had already decided based on what she'd seen. One evening, she told me she had chosen a pediatrician. I didn't know she was already doing that. I asked why she hadn't asked me. She said, "I didn't think it mattered." That sentence landed hard, not because it was cruel, because it was honest. I had slowly trained her not to expect me. That realization shook something loose in me. For the first time, I felt panic. Not fear, panic. The kind that shows up when you realize you may already be too late. I started imagining life without her in it. Not dramatically, practically. Who would I call first? Where would I live? How often would I see my child? Those thoughts scared me enough to finally speak. One night, I told her I was afraid. Really afraid. I told her I didn't know how to be what she needed, but that I wanted to learn. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, She sat quietly for a long time. Then she said something that stalked me cold. She said, "I needed that months ago." Months. Not now. Not tonight. Months ago. That's when I understood something painful. Timing matters. Good intentions don't count the same when they arrive late. I asked her if she still believed in us. She looked down at her hands before answering. That pause told me everything. She said, "I don't know." Those 3 words felt heavier than any goodbye, because they meant the future was no longer assumed. It was undecided. And undecided is dangerous when a baby is on the way. I lay awake that night listening to her breathe, wondering how 2 people could be in the same bed and feel so far apart. I thought about all the moments I had wasted being afraid of the wrong things, afraid of responsibility, afraid of change, afraid of admitting I didn't know what I was doing. And I realized something too late. The fear I avoided early on had multiplied. It had grown into something bigger, something with consequences. I just didn't know yet what form those consequences were going to take, but I was about to find out. Soon.
The first real shock didn't come in the form of an argument. It came as information. One ordinary afternoon, she told me she had taken the day off work. I asked why. She said, "I had things to take care of." That phrase again. I watched her more closely after that. Not suspicious, just aware. There's a difference. She was calm, focused, not anxious like someone hiding something. More like someone executing a plan they'd already accepted. That's when it hit me. She wasn't deciding anymore. She had decided. I just wasn't included in the moment of decision. That realization landed heavy. I started noticing changes I had ignored before. She'd updated her emergency contacts. She'd moved some money into a separate account, just in case. She'd started keeping her phone face down. Not secretive, intentional. I finally asked her directly, "Are you planning something without me?" She didn't flinch. She didn't deny it either. She said, "I'm planning for the baby." That answer was honest and incomplete, because planning for the baby without planning with me meant something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I told myself I was overthinking. That was my default setting. But deep down, something else was happening. I was losing ground. One evening, I asked her if she still saw us living together after the baby came. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I don't want to make promises I'm not sure about." That sentence felt like the floor shifting under my feet. I realized then how much I had underestimated silence. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It often means everything already has. I thought back to earlier months, to the questions she asked, to the moments she tried to connect. Those weren't complaints. They were invitations, and I ignored them. There's a special kind of regret that comes from realizing the warning signs weren't hidden at all. They were just inconvenient. I tried to reason with her. I told her people go through rough patches, that pregnancy is stressful, that we could figure things out together. She listened respectfully. Then she said something I wasn't prepared for. She said, "I already am figuring things out. I just can't wait for you to catch up." That hurt, because it was true. I had been moving at my pace. She had been moving at the baby's pace. And those 2 timelines don't always align. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to pinpoint the moment things crossed a line. But the truth was, there was no single moment. There were dozens. Small decisions, small silences, small delays, all adding up. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. I realized something else that night. I had been afraid of being overwhelmed, but now I was overwhelmed by something worse,
the possibility of being unnecessary. That's a hard thing for anyone to face, especially a man who thought showing up late was better than not showing up at all. The next day, she told me she had toured a place closer to her mother's house. She said it casually, like she was talking about groceries. I asked why. She said, "It just makes sense." I didn't argue. I didn't ask follow-up questions, because part of me already knew. That place wasn't for us. It was for her and the baby. That's when the shock finally broke through fully. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't hormones. This wasn't something time was going to fix. This was a consequence. I felt something collapse inside me. Not dramatically, quietly. The same way trust had collapsed inside her months earlier. That night, as we sat in the same room, not speaking, I realized something that scared me more than becoming a father ever had. I might not be the person she turns to when the baby arrives. I might not be the person in the room. I might not be the one she leans on. And I understood then, with painful clarity, that readiness isn't about when you finally feel prepared. It's about when the other person can no longer wait. I just didn't know yet what she was going to do next. But I knew this. Whatever it was coming soon. The strange thing about knowing something bad is coming is that your body feels it before your mind fully accepts it. I woke up each morning with a weight in my chest, like I had already lost something but didn't know how to name it yet. She moved through the house with purpose. Not hurried, not frantic, certain. That certainty scared me more than anger ever could. Anger leaves room for negotiation. Certainty doesn't. We started living parallel lives under the same roof, passing each other in the hallway, exchanging information instead of conversation, coexisting instead of connecting. I wanted to fix things, but I was starting to understand something painful. Fixing requires trust, and trust requires timing. I had missed my window. One evening, she sat down across from me and said, "We need to talk." Those words are never good. But what followed wasn't an argument. It was a summary. She spoke calmly, clearly. She told me she felt alone most of the pregnancy, that she had needed reassurance and didn't receive it, that she had learned to stop expecting me to show up emotionally. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was explaining herself. That made it worse. I listened without interrupting because interrupting felt like one more way to fail her. When she finished, I asked her what she wanted. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I want peace when the baby comes." That word stayed with me. Peace. Not love, not partnership. Peace. I realized then that her priorities had shifted in a way mine hadn't fast enough. For her, the baby had become the center. Everything else was measured by whether it supported that, including me. I asked if she was leaving. She said, "I'm not trying to punish you." That wasn't a no, that was a careful answer. She explained that she needed space to feel safe, that she needed consistency, that she couldn't afford uncertainty anymore. Those words cut deeper than blame, because they were reasonable. I couldn't argue with them. I had been uncertain, inconsistent, absent in ways that mattered. She told me she had already talked to her family, that she had support, that she wasn't making this decision impulsively. Decision. There it was. I felt something sink in my stomach. This wasn't about whether she still loved me. It was about whether she trusted me enough to build a future around me. And she didn't. Not right now. Maybe not anymore. I asked her if there was anything I could do. She thought for a moment before answering. Then she said, "I needed you to do it before I stopped asking." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she said. It explained everything. I felt regret in a way I hadn't before. Not loud regret, quiet regret. The kind that doesn't shout or cry. The kind that sits with you. She told me she planned to move closer to her mother before the baby arrived. She said it gently, like she was cushioning the blow. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. Part of me wanted to beg. Another part of me knew begging wouldn't rebuild what had already eroded. You can't ask someone to feel safe by promising you'll become someone you weren't when it mattered. That night, I packed a small bag. Not because she asked me to leave, because staying felt dishonest. As I folded clothes, I realized how many moments I'd taken for granted. The ordinary ones, shared meals, small jokes, familiar routines. Those are easy to overlook when you assume they'll always be there. She stood in the doorway, watching me pack. She didn't cry. That hurt more than if she had. Tears would have meant there was still something unresolved. Her calm told me she had already grieved. I asked her if she hated me. She shook her head. She said, "No, I just can't keep hoping you'll be different." That was the moment it truly settled. This wasn't anger. This was acceptance. I left that night. Not dramatically. No slammed doors. Just a quiet goodbye. As I drove away, it finally hit me. I hadn't just underestimated pregnancy. I had underestimated what happens when someone learns to survive without you. That realization stayed with me long after I pulled into an empty place and sat alone in the dark. And I understood something I couldn't escape anymore. The baby was coming, life was changing, and I was no longer at the center of it. But the hardest part, the part I wasn't ready for yet, hadn't even happened. Living alone after leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt unfinished. The place was quiet in a way that made time feel louder. Every sound echoed. Every thought stayed longer than I wanted it to. I told myself the space was temporary, that once the baby arrived, things would naturally pull us back together. That hope was easier to carry than the truth. Days passed without much communication. Not out of anger, out of adjustment. She was building a routine that didn't include me in the center of it. I was trying to figure out where I fit now. I checked my phone more than I'd like to admit. Every notification made my chest tighten. Every silence stretched longer. When she did reach out, it was about practical things. Medical updates, appointments, logistics. Necessary information, not connection. I started realizing something uncomfortable. I was being updated, not relied on. There's a difference. I went to one appointment after that. Sat in the waiting room, watched other couples sit together, whispering, laughing nervously. I felt like a guest in a story I was supposed to be part of. She was polite, kind, but distant. The doctor asked if I had any questions. I didn't. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't know what role I was allowed to play anymore. That question haunted me later. What role was I in now? At night, I replayed everything. The moments I could have spoken up, the times I could have listened better, the opportunities I let pass because silence felt safer. I realized then that silence doesn't protect you from pain. It delays it, and delayed pain arrives with interest. Friends asked how things were going. I gave vague answers. I wasn't ready to explain how someone could be gone without really leaving. I missed her in ordinary ways, reaching for my phone to tell her something small, thinking about a joke she'd appreciate. Those habits don't disappear just because circumstances change. They linger, like muscle memory. I saw the baby's ultrasound photo again one night. I sat there holding it longer than I expected,
trying to connect, trying to feel like this was real, trying not to feel like I had already failed. There was a moment I almost called her, not to argue, not to beg, just to say I was sorry again. But I stopped myself. Apologies don't land the same when they come after action is already taken. I had already learned that. The baby shower happened without me. That one stung. I understood the reasoning, less tension, less stress, but understanding doesn't make absence hurt less. I imagined her surrounded by family, laughing, being supported. I was glad she had that, and ashamed that I hadn't been enough of it. I started to notice a change in myself. I was quieter, more reflective, less defensive. I was finally doing the emotional work I should have done earlier. That irony wasn't lost on me. Growth, it turns out, doesn't follow the schedule we'd prefer. It shows up when it wants, often too late. One evening, she texted me something simple. "Baby's doing well." No heart emoji, no extra words, just information. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, feeling grateful, feeling disconnected, feeling like a bystander to my own life. I realized something that night. I had spent so much time being afraid of responsibility that I never stopped to consider the deeper fear underneath. Being seen, being needed, being relied on in a way that would change me permanently. And by avoiding that, I lost the chance to grow alongside her. The truth settled in slowly. She wasn't shutting me out. She was protecting herself. And the baby. That's a hard thing to argue against. I sat alone with that understanding, realizing the most painful lessons in life aren't taught through punishment. They're taught through absence. And just when I thought I had reached the bottom of that realization, another moment came. One that would change how I understood everything that had happened. One I wasn't prepared for. The call came on a day that felt ordinary enough to fool me. I was sitting alone, doing nothing important, when my phone rang. Her name on the screen still made my heart tighten. I answered too quickly. She didn't waste time easing into it. She told me she'd gone into early labor. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The room, the noise, my thoughts. I asked where she was. She told me. Then she paused. That pause told me more than her words ever could. She said, "My mom's with me." Of course she was. I asked if she wanted me there. That question came out smaller than I meant it to. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I'll let you know." I sat there holding the phone long after the call ended, waiting. Time slowed in a way I hadn't felt before. Minutes felt heavy, every second stretched. I realized something in that waiting. This was the moment I had imagined differently. I thought I'd be pacing a hospital room, holding her hand, being part of the fear and the joy and the uncertainty. Instead, I was sitting alone, waiting to be invited. The message finally came. "You can come." Those words should have felt like relief. Instead, they felt like permission. That hurt more than I expected. At the hospital, everything felt unfamiliar. The lights, the sounds, the quiet urgency. Her mother greeted me politely, kindly, but protectively. She didn't step aside. She stayed close. I understood why. I stood near the wall, unsure where to place myself, unsure what role I was allowed to play. She looked tired, focused, strong in a way that comes from necessity. She didn't reach for my hand. I didn't offer it. That space between us felt larger than the room itself. The doctor spoke. Instructions were given. Decisions were made. Mostly without me. Not out of spite, out of habit.
That's what happens when someone has learned not to wait. The baby arrived hours later. Healthy, small, perfect. When I saw that child, something inside me cracked open. Love flooded in, immediate and undeniable. But it was paired with something else, grief. Not for the baby, for everything I hadn't been. I held my child briefly, carefully, like something precious and fragile, because that's exactly what it was. When I handed the baby back, I noticed something that hit harder than I expected. She didn't look at me. She looked at her mother. That was the moment, the one that stayed with me. I wasn't the first instinct anymore. I wasn't the anchor. I was present. And presence, I finally understood, is not the same as partnership. Afterward, she rested. Her mother stayed. I lingered, unsure when leaving would feel appropriate. Eventually, she looked at me and said quietly, "You should get some rest too." Not unkind, but final. I kissed my child's forehead before leaving. That walk out of the hospital felt longer than the walk in. The parking lot was quiet. The air felt heavier. I sat in my car and didn't start it right away. I realized then that becoming a father didn't erase the consequences of how I became one. Love doesn't rewind time. It doesn't rewrite history. It simply shows you what matters most. And sometimes, it shows you what you lost. I drove home knowing something irreversible had happened. Not the birth, the realization. I could never go back and become the man she needed when it mattered most. All I could do now was decide who I would be moving forward. But I hadn't yet realized how much that decision would demand of me, because the hardest part of the story was still waiting. The days after the birth felt unreal. Time moved forward, but I felt like I was standing still, watching life rearrange itself around me. I visited when I was invited. I held my child. I changed diapers. I learned how to warm bottles and rock a newborn to sleep. I did all the things a father does. And yet, something fundamental was missing. I wasn't part of the rhythm. I was an addition to it. She moved with confidence, tired, but sure. Her mother was there constantly, helping, guiding, protecting. I understood now why she had prepared the way she did. She had built a circle she could trust. I wasn't outside it, but I wasn't holding it together either. There were moments I wanted to speak up, to say, "I'm here now." But presence after the fact doesn't erase absence before it. I learned that lesson the hard way. We spoke politely, respectfully, about schedules, about the baby's needs, about logistics. We didn't speak about us. That silence felt deliberate, like a boundary. One evening, I stayed later than usual. The baby had finally fallen asleep. The house was quiet. I looked at her and said, "You're doing an amazing job." She smiled and said, "Thank you." That was it. No invitation to come closer, no opening. I realized then that admiration without intimacy feels hollow. I asked if she was tired. She said yes. I asked if she needed help. She said no. And for the first time, I believed her. She didn't need me the way she once had. That truth hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry. I was humbled. I had underestimated what resilience looks like. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply moves forward. One night, as I was leaving, she stopped me at the door. She said, "I want us to be good co-parents." That word, co-parents. Not partners, not a couple. Co-parents. I nodded, because arguing would have been selfish, because the baby deserved peace. After that, something shifted inside me. I stopped hoping for restoration and started accepting reality. Acceptance isn't giving up, it's seeing clearly. I began to understand that readiness isn't proven by intention, it's proven by timing. And my timing had been off. I loved my child, deeply, but love doesn't excuse delay. It doesn't erase neglect. It doesn't undo underestimation. It simply asks you to do better next time. The weight of that responsibility settled in slowly. This wasn't about her forgiving me. This was about me becoming someone my child could depend on, consistently, without being asked. I left that night knowing I couldn't change the past, but I could no longer afford to misunderstand the future. I had spent so much time thinking about what I lost, I hadn't yet faced the hardest truth, what I would have to change to never lose something like this again. That realization didn't come with drama. It came quietly, and it was relentless.
It took time for the lesson to fully settle in. Not weeks, not months, years. Because some truths don't reveal themselves all at once. They unfold as life gives you enough distance to finally see clearly. I became a father that day in the hospital, but I became a man later, much later. I showed up for my child consistently after that, not loudly, not perfectly, but reliably. I learned routines, I learned patience, I learned how to listen instead of defend. And in the quiet moments, the long drives home, the late nights alone, I learned something harder. Love isn't proven by how strongly you feel it. It's proven by how early you act. I thought being ready meant not being afraid. What I learned is that readiness means being honest about your fear before it turns into silence. Silence cost me more than I ever expected. Not because it made me a bad person, but because it made me late. Late to reassurance, late to partnership, late to understanding what was being asked of me. The betrayal in this story wasn't infidelity, it was absence. And absence doesn't announce itself as betrayal until the damage is already done. If there's one thing I would tell my younger self, it would be this. Showing up halfway is not the same as showing up on time. People can forgive mistakes. What's harder to forgive is being left alone while carrying something heavy. Pregnancy revealed what I didn't want to see, that love without presence feels empty, that responsibility delayed becomes responsibility denied, that underestimating someone's breaking point doesn't mean it isn't approaching. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because too many people believe they'll have time later. Later to listen. Later to step up. Later to change. Later is a promise life doesn't always keep. If you're listening to this and you're standing at the edge of something important, a relationship, a responsibility, a moment that requires more of you than comfort allows, don't wait to feel ready. Readiness isn't a feeling, it's a decision, and decisions lose their power when they come too late. I thought I was ready for a baby. I wasn't. But the lesson stayed with me. And if this story reaches someone before silence does its damage, then maybe it didn't end in loss after all.